Hi, my name is Kate, and I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Oxford, where I study economic and social history. I'm very excited that you're also thinking about studying history at the university level, and in this video, I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the reasons I find it such a compelling and exciting field. My own research concerns 19th and 20th century Mexico and Central America, where I look at issues of displacement, sovereignty, and development. In this video, however, I'm less interested in looking at a specific region or time period, and more interested in thinking about method. That is, how do we know, or what we think we know, about the past? My objectives then are threefold. First, I want to think about the many different sources that we might use to think about and interpret the past. Second, I want to home in on one of those sources, oral history, and think about its possibly unique contributions to our understanding of history. Finally, I want to introduce some basic principles in research ethics and help you to plan your own oral history interview, should that be something of interest. Before diving into these questions, however, I want to take a step back and consider a sort of meta question that underlines everything I'm going to talk about today. That is, what is history anyway? The Haitian scholar Michel Houve-Touillot writes, "Human beings participate in history both as actors and as narrators. In vernacular use, history means both the facts of the matter and a narrative of those facts, both what happened and that which is said to have happened. The first meaning places the emphasis on the socio-historical process, the second on our knowledge of that process, or on a story about that process." So, how do we get from what happened to what appears in our history textbooks, documentaries, and other representations of the past? In other words, how do we fashion narratives about history? At this point, I'd ask you to pause the video and think a little bit more about this question. How do you think historians create understandings of the past, or how do you imagine that we do so? Now, I do want to be clear that there are many ways of understanding the past, and the study of history, as I'm discussing here as an academic endeavor, is just one way. If you have other ideas about how people remember and preserve parts of the past, you're also welcome to reflect on those. Now, clearly, there's no one answer to this question, and I've included on this slide just a few of the many things you might be thinking about. This might be artifacts in museums, papers in archives, newspapers, works of art, books, etc. All of these are ways that historians try to access the past. They're all part of an infinite body of what we call sources. This video will talk a lot about sources and how we can distinguish between them, but I want to start with one very broad division with which you might already be familiar, and that's the distinction between primary and secondary sources. A primary source, generally speaking, is something that was created during the time period in question. In my research on 19th century Mexico and labor migration, some of the primary sources I'm consulting are letters written by government officials, records of imports and exports, laws and acts passed during the period, travelers' accounts, newspapers, and so on. But a hugely important part of being an historian, and indeed of doing research in any field, is being in conversation with other people who are interested in similar issues. This is where secondary sources come in. Fortunately for me, I don't need to reconstruct the whole history of Mexico to write about migration in one small part. Other people have already done that. I might disagree with certain parts of their interpretation or have ideas and connections that I want to add. But however much my thinking diverges from or coincides with theirs, I get to engage with other people in a sort of slow motion conversation. This literature that I'm engaging, these other interpretations of the past, is composed of secondary sources. Now, I've also included on this slide tertiary sources because some people draw a second distinction between secondary and tertiary sources. Tertiary sources would tend to be sort of more abstract and wide-ranging narratives of the past that draw mostly on secondary sources rather than primary source research. So many history textbooks, for instance, are what we could call tertiary sources. I think it's more helpful to think of them as a sort of subset of secondary sources rather than their own unique category, but you are more than welcome to use whatever distinctions you find most helpful. So again, let's pause here and think about anything historical. That could be a person, a place, a process, whatever you're interested in. And I'd like to ask you to consider what primary sources you would look for to learn more about this thing. What secondary sources would you use? At this point, I don't want you to worry if those sources even exist, if it would require time travel to access them, whatever. Just think about what you could access to learn more about this thing. Now that you've thought a little bit about that question, I have another one for you. Did you include any mention of speaking with another person? Like anything, the study of history has its own history. And for a long time, and in some circles to this day, oral history has not been taken very seriously by many academic historians. Importantly, there are oral traditions and narrative practices in African, Indigenous, and diaspora communities that have been practiced for centuries. Indeed, orality, speaking, is the longest existing way of transferring information through time in human communities. However, in academic history, which has long privileged the written word, documents on paper and other sources, oral sources have been met with some suspicion. Narratives transmitted orally, some have argued, are not reliable. They're changeable, they might differ from one retelling to the next. And what I'll refer to in this video as oral histories, interviews conducted with the purpose of understanding the past, were thought to have similar problems. People's memories are poor, they remember things selectively or not at all, and they may even intentionally omit important details or be less than accurate in their account for many reasons. Now, on the other hand, many historians have argued that methods like oral history are much better suited to documenting certain parts of the past than written sources. So I want you to pause again here and consider why that might be. What might be some of the advantages or possibilities of oral history? Okay, you've probably surmised that I think there are many possibilities of oral history, and I want to talk about just a few here. First, oral sources allow you as the researcher to co-create the interview. Written sources are static. You can interpret them, but they won't speak back to you when you question them. Similarly, you can often go back to an interviewee to clarify something or ask additional questions, whereas with written sources, there's not the same possibility to generate new material. Second, official sources like government archives, newspapers, and other records are often recorded from positions of relative power, whether that be the state or another elite actor. Oral history offers an opportunity to understand what has been called history from below, leading to a fuller and more complex understanding of the past that incorporates multiple vantage points. For instance, many people may never appear in the written record that appears in government archives, newspapers, etc., or they may only appear in certain ways, for instance, as criminals in court cases. Oral history allows us to move beyond that written record to understand how people's lives and everyday experiences were shaped outside of their interface with those more powerful actors. Finally, working with oral sources isn't really that different from working with written ones. Many of the so-called problems of oral sources hold true for written documents as well, and thinking carefully about how to work with this kind of evidence is important for developing analytical and interpretive skills that will serve you well whether you're working with oral sources or any other kind of source. Now, I want to talk briefly about this last point before moving on to discussing conducting an oral history interview. Accuracy is important, and as anyone who has lost their keys or phone can attest, human memory isn't always very accurate or reliable. So how do we deal with this when we're trying to use someone's recollection as a historical source? A key concept here is triangulation. This means taking data points from, in this case, an interview, and checking to see if they coincide with what you know from other sources. For instance, if someone mentions that a building burned down, you could check newspapers to corroborate the date and location. If someone's talking about how much things cost, you could check historical price indices. So here are some examples of things a person might say. Take a moment to think about how you could triangulate with other sources to verify this information. 1. I started working at Arnold Elementary School when it opened in 1967. 2. I lived at 89 Elm Street, half a mile from the bowling alley on West Street. 3. The first thing we published was an essay about solidarity with student movements in Latin America. So just taking the first one as an example, we can kind of break this down into 3 pieces of information that we would want to verify. One is actually just the name of the school, Arnold Elementary School. Is that a place that existed? Has the person maybe misremembered exactly what it was called, etc.? Second is the date that it opened. And third is this person's employment history there. We might need to look at different sources to verify each of those pieces of information. We could probably, at this point, do a quick Google search to confirm that Arnold Elementary School does exist and that it exists in this place where the person lived. That might also tell us what we need to know about the date that it opened in 1967. But if we can't access it that way, we might look at historical newspapers to see when the school opened and where it was located, or things like that. Employment is going to be a little bit more challenging. Depending on the prominence of this person's position, again, we could use newspapers if that would be part of the public record. But it's unlikely that something this recent, where the person is still alive, would be open to us as historians in the school's own archive or the local government archive, something like this. So we might need to look to other interviewees to corroborate that information. Maybe we look for a colleague of this person or something like this, depending on how crucial it is that we confirm, yes, this person started working here in 1967. So there are lots of issues related to, what exactly am I needing to corroborate? How important is it that it's exactly correct, that we know, the complete quote unquote accuracy of this person's account? There are going to be things that you perhaps can't corroborate and that you just have to trust. And other things that maybe you realize, oh, there's actually a difference between what this person said and what I'm finding in other sources. And that's a problem I want to talk about now. So if you do find that when you check certain pieces of information, there are what we might call inaccuracies, some of this could be attributed to forgetfulness. Maybe it opened in 1966, not 1967, and that's a kind of minor detail, perhaps. But it's also important to think about why there might be this difference between what someone tells you in an interview and what you see in the documentary record or what you've heard in other interviews. In fact, asking yourself why and how people come to have certain understandings of events is often much more productive than focusing narrowly on the accuracy of their account. It's often in this disjuncture between what you expect to hear or what you've seen in other places and what someone tells you in an interview that the most interesting ideas emerge, because it creates a sort of puzzle. A lot of the characteristics of oral history that require us to think very carefully about the claims that we can make as historians are also characteristics of written sources. Even the most boring, banal-seeming document was created for a reason and from a particular perspective. The same techniques that we use to work with oral history, triangulation, looking for puzzles and contradictions, paying attention to how a source was created and for what purpose, are also useful for working with non-oral sources. Now, a final possibility of oral history that I haven't mentioned yet is that not only can it democratize the range of people that are considered serious historical actors, but it can also be a much more accessible form of historical research for many people. While there are many important oral history projects with thousands of interviews and professional interviewers, oral history is also something that you can do with your family and community, whether you have a particular research question in mind or are more hoping to preserve memories and experiences. So in what remains of this video, I want to walk you through a basic outline of a pretty simple oral history interview. We'll talk about research ethics, best practices for conducting and preserving the interview, and some tips for getting started. Here's a quick overview of where we're headed with what remains of this presentation. Now, I should flag here that historical scholarship that uses oral history is a little bit distinctive in that the subjects are still, of course, living in most cases. This means there are different considerations in play than if you're consulting the archives of someone who's been dead for a long time. First, in any research project, you'll start with a question. With oral history, that's going to be very closely related to the people you want to interview. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to think about what life was like for young women in my grandmother's generation. And then I want to think of a series of sub-questions that focus my research. Maybe I'm interested in the environment and public parks and open spaces, and I want to know how women used them, what they thought of them, and how they changed over time. Already I can start to think of some questions that I could use in the interview. Could you tell me about the city or town where you grew up? How much time did you spend outside as a girl? Where did you spend that time? And so on. So you can see I have a gradual narrowing process from my overall research question down to specific interview questions. But one of the sort of nice things about oral history, but also one of its challenges, as opposed to more structured social scientific surveys, is that you can let the interview follow a path that you didn't expect. This can be very fruitful, as it can shine lights on issues or experiences you weren't aware of or hadn't thought to consider. So it's always good to have a list of questions ready to go at the start of an interview, but you should be prepared to set it aside and even abandon it completely when you actually sit down and hear the person start talking. When interviewing, your goal is to learn from the narrator. This means that you should come up with questions that allow them to share their experience to the largest extent possible in their own words. Good interview questions, then, are typically open-ended, allowing the interviewee to describe rather than give a simple yes or no. They also avoid biasing the interviewee one way or another in the question itself. So here again, I'll ask you to pause the video and think about whether these questions are strong questions or whether there are ways that you could improve them. I'll do the first one as an example. So this question, did you have a positive experience in high school, requires only a yes or no answer, and it already has a value judgment embedded in it. Something like, could you tell me about your experiences at Hillsmere Elementary, or what was your first day of school like, might be better alternatives that allow the person to describe their experience in their own words. This brings me to actually conducting the interview. You have your questions, you've identified someone you'd like to talk to. Now what? First, safety is paramount, both for you and for the interviewee. If you're interviewing someone you don't know well, you'll want to meet in a public but quiet place. You'll also want to let a trusted adult, like a parent or teacher, know where you're going and what you're doing. Safety, though, also means thinking about the possible repercussions of your project for the people that you're interviewing. Particularly if you're discussing a contentious topic and plan on publishing your work, you need to seriously consider what the potential ramifications could be for the people that you're talking to. That's really a subject for a whole other video. So for now, I'd suggest that you focus on people and topics that are unlikely to pose that kind of risk to you or the interviewees. If you go on to conduct oral research in a university setting, you'll likely be asked to work with what's called an IRB, or Institutional Review Board, that will help walk you through the ethical implications of your project before you even start conducting interviews, so that you can be sure you fully considered any possible consequences for your interviewees. So, you've found someone to interview, you've explained your project to them and why their story in particular is important, and you've arranged time to meet. What happens during the interview? Before you even start asking questions, there are some important things you need to do. First, you always need the consent of the person you're planning to interview. This means that you've explained your project, described the things you plan to discuss, and discussed how or if the interview will be recorded. And then the interviewee needs to agree to this plan. Typically, you use a consent form for this, and I'll include an example in the additional resources that come with this video. But in more informal settings, or if literacy is a problem, you can also obtain oral consent by recording the interviewee agreeing to the interview. You'll most likely want to record the interview with an audio device, such as a mobile phone or other recorder. If you're doing the interview remotely over a platform like Skype or Zoom, you can probably record within that platform. However, some interviewees may not want to be recorded at all, and that's their choice. You can ask if they're all right with you taking handwritten notes instead. If they do consent to be recorded with some kind of recording device, you always need to let them know when you've turned it on. It's often best, once you've begun the interview, to start with basic informational questions to get you both comfortable. This can be like, please state your full name and date of birth. Could you tell me a little bit about where you grew up? Could you tell me a little bit about the members of your family? Things like this. As you talk, you'll begin to get a sense for how the person prefers to narrate their experiences. Some people may move strictly chronologically from childhood to adulthood, and others may have more idiosyncratic ways of thinking about their experience, moving backward and forward in time, looping back to certain experiences over and over, etc. Thinking about the structure of the interview and their narrative can be an important source for you as well as you go on to process what you're hearing. A good length for most interviews is 45 minutes to an hour. Much longer than that, and you'll both get very tired. Remember, you can always schedule a follow-up interview if you find you haven't discussed everything you want to cover, or if the interview raised questions and ideas you hadn't previously considered. As you come to the end of the interview, you'll probably want to ask the interviewee if there's anything further they'd like to add, something that you haven't managed to discuss. Then you can stop recording and let them know that you're doing so. At this point, you'll need the interviewee to release the interview to you. This means that they're assigning copyright to you and giving you permission to use the interview for the purposes that you specified at the outset. So for instance, you might say, I would request permission to use this interview for educational and research purposes, something like this. At this point, you'll also want to ask the interviewee if there are any conditions they want to impose on your use of the interview. They want to anonymize the interview or seal it for a certain amount of time so that no one else can access it until 5 years have passed or until the interviewee has perhaps passed away. You should include a note of these conditions on the release form that the interviewee signs. Now that you've finished the interview, it's important to save it and all of the accompanying documents. Creating a folder for each interview is a good practice. There you can keep the audio file, the consent and release forms, and any other documents like photos or newspaper clippings that the interviewee may have shared with you. You'll also want to include a transcript of the interview. And this brings me to transcription. Again, this could be the subject of a whole class. Transforming a spoken exchange into printed words is a complicated task. The additional resources included with this video include a guided transcription that provides more detail. But in short, transcribing an interview makes it much easier to work with for many people, as it becomes a searchable document that you can quickly scan for keywords and ideas. Many interviewees will also value being sent a transcript of their interview, and you probably want to maintain relationships with the people with whom you've spoken, so this can be a great way to do that. Now, this has been a ton of information in a very short amount of time, so I want to quickly recap 3 major ideas. First, we talked about how historians use a wide variety of sources to interpret the past. We also noted that the ways that they work with those sources has changed over time. Then we discussed oral history and the ways it can allow a more open and co-creative process of historical research. Finally, something I want to leave you with is the idea that the interpersonal practice of oral history interviewing and attendant concerns about ethics, community, and representation can help us to think more critically about all historical practice, whether we are interfacing with living people or not. Finally, the additional resources that accompany this video will be helpful in refreshing your memory and getting you started if you choose to conduct an oral history interview. Even if you don't have a research project in mind, I do encourage you to think about interviewing a family member or someone else whose life story you'd like to share and preserve. It can be a wonderful and meaningful experience for you both. Whether you're interested in oral history research in the long term or curious about all of the many different sources that we use to interpret the past, I hope this video has been helpful and thought-provoking. Thanks very much for